The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Carol Mahoney. We'll just be starting the call in a few minutes. We've gone live so that we can test the recording of this call. If you can just bear with us, the actual session will start in approximately 3 or 4 minutes. And it'll just be silence most probably, or Mike and myself just talking in the meantime. Mike, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. Let's just transfer you now. Right. Mike, your screen now should have control.
Yep.
Perfect, I can see you.
Lovely. And I've got a new fast wireless modem thingy, so if I move the screen, it should update a lot more quickly than it used to. Like 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
Good. That seems to be what the problem was. The wireless dongle I got with this machine was very, very slow. And,
all right. Well,
probably also
crossed.
wasn't optimal on what wireless channels it was using. So I installed this new one, and it's now much faster than anything I've ever seen. So
fantastic.
hopefully that
Good.
won't cause any problems anymore.
All right. Well, I will leave it in peace until the hour. Oh, actually, you can start at that point, and I will just release anybody on their lines. Right, Mike, it is now gone the hour. Good morning, everybody. I'll hand over to Mike Bennett to start this call.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's call. I see 1 or 2 people still arriving, but we'll get started, I think, fairly shortly. So there's fairly little to do today, but I think this is a good opportunity for us to have a look at the overall model, look at what it is that we're submitting. So let me just recap on where we are in terms of the standards process and what we're doing with this model and what happens next. So last week we looked at some fairly fundamental changes that we'd previously talked about, which separate out 2 kinds of control relationships. One being what would essentially be the input to any kind of analysis, which would be the holding of some kind of controlling interest by some party. So the holding of shares, voting shares, partner equity, and so on. And the other was the assertions of actual or de facto control, which might be derived from carrying out some analysis on those input factors, or might be asserted in filings or elsewhere. And so that was quite a big catch on our part to distinguish those two kinds of control. It means that we no longer, for example, hardwire in assumptions that if something has 51% of shares, for example, or 80% of shares or whatever, that it's therefore a majority controlling party. That may well be the case, but by separating out the input factors from the conclusions, it allows us to have a completely separate hierarchy of facts about facto control, either asserted or included. Somebody has a lot of background noise. If you can mute yourselves locally, that saves us having to mute you from here. Thanks. And if we have muted you from here, just pop something in the questions queue, and I'm keeping an eye on that on another screen, so I will get to you. There's very little. So basically, we wanted to finalise the model last week, and I think we pretty much did. But there were a couple of changes we made that I need to present back to you this week, just to make sure we've got them right and maybe fine-tune some of that. This is then going to be the final version of the standard that goes into the OMG process as a draft. Now, of course, there will be opportunities to look at this further. In particular, there's two lots of changes that we can start to look at over the coming months before we try and finalise this in a May timeframe for submission to the June OMG meeting. One of those is a lot of technical stuff around semantic web implementation and so on, which will be done separately from these calls, and that will start from the baseline that we submit into the OMG process. And the other, which is where you come in, is the ability to actually go through these models and diagrams at a bit more leisure, show them to your colleagues and so on, and make additional comments and corrections and additions to the model. So what we need to have for this stage of the model is that we've captured the basics and we've captured it right, and any new things that emerge can really be added to what's already here. This is one of the advantages of a semantic style of modeling, provided that we create the right kind.
I just got your case. So when you're requesting,
thanks. So that as long as we've got the right levels of abstraction, these fairly deep hierarchies that you see, any new concepts that people identify and want to include can always be added to those. The problem comes if we haven't abstracted enough. For the background noise there, and we would end up having to break the model. So what I want to do today is make sure that we're all comfortable that the terms that we have form a good baseline from which future business changes can be added to the model, rather than having to break any of these taxonomic hierarchies of concepts. So what I want to do then is have a quick look at what we did last time, make sure everybody's comfortable with what we're seeing here, and then I think this would be a good opportunity for us to look over the rest of the model and look at what's in scope, what are the stubs, if you like, or sort of core skeleton terms for some of the areas that we know we will want to extend further into, in particular fund-related entities and special purpose vehicles and so on. So I want to make sure that what we put in this draft is the core of those kind of terms that we can then add to later on. So let's start at the beginning. So just a reminder then, I'll just bring up the little diagram thing on the right here so you can get an idea of where we are within the diagram. I'll trundle up to the top. We have these kind of what we call parties. This is some entity standing in some role, and in fact the entity itself a potential party, or what we've called an involved party. This is actually a logical union of several kinds of things, and this corresponds to what's often called party, what's sometimes called person in the ECFR thing. This is any entity that can perform any business party role. So not some of our informal entities that we identified earlier, but anything that can own something or hold shares or participate in some kind of relationship. Not necessarily a legal person, could be a non-incorporated person, for example, and could also be a natural person, which is different from some of the scope of the LEI, for example. So to be able to be a controlling party, so we have two kinds of control party here. Let's trundle across to the left. Two kinds of controlling party. A controlling party has some kind of control. We have our controlling interest parties. This is the share ownership hierarchies, partnership partners, and other such organisation members who hold some means of control. In particular, those that hold some de jure controlling interests, such as voting shares and so on, as a controlling interest party. We also added parties that have not some controlling interest, but some option to exercise some controlling interest. This is something we added last time as well. So we have particular kinds of bondholder, like Koto bondholders. We have option holders and warrant holders. This is one area where we can think about, have we got the abstractions right? Should Koto bondholder be a subtype of some more general kind of bondholder or instrument holder, for example? So these are the input side of any analysis. This is something that may or may not be a controller, a parent, etc., but which holds some instrument of de jure control, such as shares or partnership equity or something like that. And then on the other side, we have the conclusions or assertions about control. And there's two things we put in here. So one is whether such control, having been concluded or asserted, is exercised individually or jointly. So we identified the need for joint control. And so here's the new thing I've added to the model, is the idea of some group of entities which have formed some alliance or agreement such that they jointly exercise control over some entity. So I've modeled this as a kind of group. Now, earlier on, we talked about groups of entities and decided to leave them out of the model, or at least out of the scope. I've now brought that in scope because one place where we do want to talk about groups of entities is when we want to talk about entities that have formed some kind of alliance, such that they each hold a certain amount of voting shares, for example, or some other controlling interest, and they agree between them to exercise that controlling interest jointly, thereby being a joint controlling party. Then we have the individual controlling party, and this is the ancestor of our parent or majority controlling term. So that's some affiliate controlling such person directly or indirectly through one or more intermediaries. I haven't tried to model direct versus indirect control, so that's something we need to think about, whether that would be an issue for future extension of the model or not. But also in between individual controlling party and majority controlling party, we talked about control based on some kind of percentage. So not percentage of shares necessarily or any of the other input factors, but that in performing some kind of analysis, one ends up concluding that some entity has some percentage of de facto control over some entity. I want to make sure that that is actually right and that we weren't getting mixed up between the input and the output when we thought about that. The percentage term is in here, but because of the icon that I've used, you can't actually see it. So it has a property called percentage de facto control, and the type of that property is percentage. So it is in this term, and that's then inherited by the majority controlling party. Although it's not modeled as such, that's one where the percentage control that you've concluded that the entity has is more than 50%. Do we also want a total controlling party underneath that? I think we actually have that. there's also another wrinkle I want to iron out, because at the moment I'm not completely happy with it, which is that in talking about what percentages of control something is asserted or concluded as holding, percentage of de facto control, of course, there was also talk of different types of control. Again, this is more common on the left-hand side, the input side of things, where you would talk about what percentages of voting shares and what class of shares those are, and so on. So I want to challenge and question this idea of, are there types of control on the conclusion side? If control is simply the ability to direct the affairs of something, then are there types of ability to direct the affairs of something, or are we inadvertently putting input type of facts into this output side of the semantics? So as a semantic model, we need to have meaningful concepts both for the assertions about these controlling interests and for the conclusions one would draw, because anything that you want to see in a data model, we need to capture the business semantics of. So is this on the right side? This is the question. And if it is, I haven't tried to model types of control, because what is a type of control? You either can direct the affairs of something by yourself, or you can direct the affairs of something in conjunction with a bunch of other people, or you can't direct the affairs of something. So I'm suspicious of this percentage control, and if there are types of control, we ought to be able to think of names for them as types of control, not as types of controlling interest, because those are already taken care of over there on the left. So I'll stop talking now and give people a chance to comment on that. I'd like to see if we can clear up these kinds of open questions so that we can get some finality on this, or at least define some kind of stubs that we can build out from when we get more clarity on some of these things. So, any thoughts, comments, please?
Hi, Marcus. Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi. I was one case that comes up under this category of the type of control and if or when they might exercise it. We might have covered this. Would be sort of the let's say the government regulator, who could come in and, based upon some decision, could take control. There's no explicit contract saying they have control. You would not calculate it as a percentage of an alliance necessarily, but it kind of represents the transitory states of how you get from one snapshot of a picture to another stat, a transitionary state, the exercise of control, or the probability that something will happen. It seems to me that we've captured a static view of control, but maybe we have not captured the ways that over time or through actions, control could be exercised through other types of abilities to exercise control, optionality of the regulator being one, and just throwing that as a case that kind of suggests that there's other dynamic aspects, perhaps on the right-hand side, of your model, as opposed to the more specific aspects of de jure control on the left-hand side. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Mm. That makes sense.
I mean, one of the things that it seems like we would need to recognize that what actually happens when control is exercised or when decisions are made, there are a lot of different outcomes that could occur. There's a lot of volatility, and a lot of things can happen that end up basically, making what happens as history, and that transitory or optional or probabilistic nature of things, which goes from one snapshot to the next in terms of, say, a regulator, taking control of a financial institution that's failed, or somebody, some other factors that were to come in and cause, let's say, a decision to sell a company, or what these types of things are more complex, obviously, but they seem to be part of a larger model of of how the world is working from a systemic point of view that is more probabilistic.
Ah, okay.
So,
So let's
so I,
unpack that.
so it's Chris. I had a couple of observations or thoughts, just in terms of the nature of control. The first is that I sort of agree in terms of, you know, you have control or you don't have control, and that but I wonder and that when you control it, you know, at least in theory, at first sight, it appears that you can control it, you can make it do what you will, and it's difficult. Maybe it's difficult legally, maybe it's difficult practically to describe what the barriers or the boundaries to that control are. But a couple of thoughts is, when we start introducing percentage into control, then that feels like we are talking about a type of control, as opposed to you control or you don't control. In terms of what do we mean by 60% control, unless we mean by a type of control, I suppose. The second thing is just in terms of what Jeff was saying. I mean, I think the regulator or rather not necessarily the regulator, but the, you know, sovereign nations have got powers to pass laws, and you can't control, and you know, it's not actually worth considering the ability of governments to pass laws in the same way, you know, in that it is like an act of God, in that it's a factor, at least to a large degree, out of your control. You could argue that bankers can take different decisions, which means that governments won't regulate them or won't pass laws, but nevertheless, in general, it's a sort of an outside intervention. But one which is less outside is one where you, for example, you have governments that got golden shares, and those shares may not be majority shares, but they may just have a single golden share that gives them the power to do something under certain circumstances, or the power to say yes or no to certain types of motion being passed, or things like that. And golden shares, particularly in where formerly state-owned enterprises, is one where governments, where it's not a question of passing a new regulation or passing a new law, but governments actually do have a certain amount of control.
So let me unpack that. I think this seems to be the answer. So far from, you know, I was originally concerned about two things that seem to be problematic, and you sort of brought them together in a way that answers them. I was thinking that percentage was fine, but I was questioning whether it should be on the right, and then percentage and type seemed like a complex extra step. But in fact, from what you're saying, and this makes perfect sense, you can't talk about percentage without talking about a type of control. So on this output, this right-hand side, the only times you would talk about percentage is when you're talking about a percentage of a kind of control. So we would need, in order to do that, to talk about different kinds of control. And those kinds of control can only be framed in terms of a boundary to what you can or can't do. So control in the round is the ability to make the organization do absolutely anything, you know, stand on its head or whatever. Whereas where you have, say, you know, particularly as a result of perhaps some government intervention on a failing bank or something like that. And remember, this is any entity at all, but banks are an interesting edge case with some of the kinds of things that happen to them. That when a government intervenes, you know, buys out a section of the bank, if it's got any sense, takes on some kind of controlling equity, or in some cases it doesn't, and we all wonder why. But if it did, it might be that control that's being exercised, whether it's in terms of some new class of share or in terms of some side contract, would have bounds to it. You would say that, yeah, this government or this regulator or this other entity might have control to do some things, but not control to do others. It might be able to change the capital structure but not sack the directors, but it might be able to sack the directors but not change the capital structure or something like that. So on this right-hand side, we can talk about not just the power to do anything, but the power to do specific things, and the extent to which the power to do those specific things may be exercised. So this sounds like a stub situation.
Yeah.
This is the kind of thing we could extend out in future iterations of this model, kinds of control where a kind of control is framed in terms of control to do what, which means it has to be framed in terms of relationships to business activities or business processes or business events. I think probably activities. So that each of the kinds of control we can talk about percentages of would be in relation to a kind of de facto control that has a relationship to some activity. So I can model the stubs for that, if you like, and that would take care of this percentage character over here, which would then come out of this hierarchy and be another kind of entity controlling party with a percentage and a type.
Yeah, I haven't got my head around the boundaries for what control can do and what can't do, because I don't feel I know the space well enough. But just one thought in terms of the percentage. I think you're right in terms of a percentage control implies this is the difference between the data model and the business logic, if you like, in terms of in the data you will often know that that a company will say it has 70% control, but it won't say, or rather something as a 70% subsidiary, and the subsidiary is in that context is about control, but it won't say how that control, what it means by 70% of what it won't say necessarily. So in the data, you won't necessarily know the nature of that control, whether it's through contract or ownership or whatever.
Right.
But in the business model, obviously, then in the business logic, obviously has to be some mechanism for doing it. Otherwise, it won't exist. And so I think that you're right in terms of saying that percentage, or I was saying, and you were saying as well, that the percentage should be of that control should be associated with some type of control, and mechanism for control. But when the data is published, that mechanism may not be published. Just the percentage may be published. But I think in the real world, what exists, what is not necessarily published, I think it probably has to be associated with some sort of mechanism for exercising the control. In terms of what you're allowed to do, if you like, the legal aspects, obviously there are many boundaries to those legal aspects. There's what the Articles of Association allow you to do. There's what the overriding law allows you to do as a director, for example, or as a shareholder. There's overriding rights of minority shareholders. There's all sorts of things which you can and can't do, some of which you may do even if you aren't allowed to do them, if you see what I mean.
So it's a bit like you can have a contract where one of the clauses in the contract would be invalid because it would be overwritten by statute, but that doesn't stop either party from signing the contract in ignorance of that fact.
Yeah, so I think, but I would prefer someone else to, who's got a more legalistic view, if you like, than me to frame that part of it.
Yeah. Any of the legal folks able to chime in on that? So I think what we've got there is two features of this right-hand side, and you've absolutely understood and reflected what we're trying to say here. But you might have data which asserts or is a conclusion about some percentage of some kind of control without knowing what the instants are. So it is definitely on this right-hand side. And separate. So that's how to model that, or if we can, I think not. We could say there's a percentage of control that's been included, and then there's the kind of control which is so exercised, and percentages of control can only be framed in terms of those kinds of control. And we can where I started this note here is to say that there'll be some subclasses of de facto control, maybe just one as a stub, which would be de facto control with a relationship to an activity, and then that can be subclassed indefinitely for kinds of activity and kinds of control as and when one discovers them. And in principle, at the top of that tree can be any kind of control and any kind of activity. So let me, I think it should be one of these. De facto, what would we call it? So at the top level, we're talking about absolute de facto control, the ability to direct the activities of an entity without limits. So here we're talking about limited de facto control, yeah? And that would be the ability to direct the affairs of some entity within prescribed limits. Those limits are described in terms of activities which the entity holding such control may carry out. Now, I guess I've just raised another question there. Are we talking about not the ability of the entity to do something, it's the ability of the entity to direct the other entity, the controlled entity, to do something, isn't it? So it's framed in terms of the actions which the entity holding control may cause controlled entity to carry out. Is that an accurate reflection of what can then be built out to describe the kinds of control that one can assert percentages of, using future extensions of this model to describe those kinds of control in terms of activities which the controlled entity can be caused to carry out?
Yeah, you could almost call it persuasion.
Oh, no. New concept this late in the day. No. Interesting point, because, oh no, you do raise an interesting point there, which is that so far, I think this is probably all we can do, we're talking about control in terms of absolute. You either absolutely can or can't make the controlled entity do the thing. Well, anything less than absolute is percentage, so persuasion is, yeah, okay, that's good.
Right.
And you might hold that percentage of control in conjunction, by looking at the assertions about percentage of control, you can then look at the assertions about other entities holding percentages of the same control. If they were to work together, you then know that they can make the entity do that thing, and if they were not to work together, you can work out who could or could not make the entity do that thing. So we have enough kinds of assertion here for people to do further processing and draw further inferences from that could be useful, and we've captured the nature of the assertions. Good, I'm happy with this. Is everybody else happy with it? That's more important.
Yeah, one thing that's kind of it's on a tangent and we'll get away from it quickly. But this notion of the ability for people to exercise control within their limits to affect the outcome, one could almost take that as, if you look at the entity itself, as how the members of the entity work together to control the destiny of the entity in terms of staff and people, doing their particular roles. It kind of opens up this entire new model of looking at the actual operations of the entity, which is outside of
the
scope.
operation. Oh, well, no, we looked at executives earlier, and I guess I think we should look at that next to see whether that is suitably stubbed, that it can be extended into other. There's two kinds of natural persons that you're talking about here. One is executives who have particular executive authority, which is a kind of delegation of control, but we agreed it's not really a kind of control, it's an authority to act on behalf of something. And then you have members, particularly in partnerships, incorporated partnerships, also other kinds of, but whether incorporated or non-incorporated, kinds of entity where you have members who have particular roles, and very often in those kind of entities, maybe there's nobody that isn't a member, but those members each have some controlling interest in that they hold some level of controlling equity, or in the case of limited partners, non-controlling equity, so they don't assert control. So those are controlling interests. Then hopefully these kinds of conclusions about control are none of them dependent on what kind of entity it is or what kind of members there are. So each of these things that are a controlling entity, remember that they're all any kind of involved party, which includes natural persons, an individual, for example, and indeed a club or anything other than an illicit cartel, which can't openly hold stuff. So this needs to be framed, and I'm just thinking how many things I can do while we're on screen. I can frame this in terms of some activity. So, here we go. We've got a whole model of activities, but it's outside of the scope of this release at the moment. This would cause us to bring it into scope. And I'm at this late stage with the technical work we're doing, the OWL side of things and so on. I'm hoping not to change the fundamental scope of what's in or out of scope in the foundations. So what I think we're going to have to do is, I can put this relationship in, but the end of the relationship is not going to be not going to be able to traverse that to find activity, because activity is not yet formalized enough to be part of the foundations. So I'm thinking out loud. Don't worry about that. I'll figure out what to do about that. But this will have relationship to activity, even if I just bring that in as one class and put it somewhere where we can find it. Now this percentage character then lives in a different tree from the rest of these things. So percentage is mainly framed in terms of having a particular kind of control. So we can talk about how controlling entity defined in terms of percentage has a relationship with this kind of a relationship. Treatment, find it. There it is framed in terms of some limited de facto control. Exercises type of that's probably all we need to say on that. Label the line, and that will be specialization of the meaning of this relationship. Okay. Now, if we've got our percentage control is based on some type of control, where does that leave our good old-fashioned parent, the entity that has some majority of overall non-specific type of control, all control of the activities of some other entity? So a parent of specialized person is an affiliate controlling such person directly or indirectly through one or more intermediaries. This isn't based on a percentage, not on the conclusion side, so we'll say it's simply a kind of individual controlling party. And yeah, does that make sense? So control is either individual or joint, maybe defined in terms of a percentage. Should the percentage still be as an individual? Is it the individual that holds that, or you can talk about a joint controlling party also having percentage of control, so these should be non-disjoint. Oh, and this individual and joint should be mutually exclusive from one another, shouldn't they? Let's just put that in. In other words, as a set theoretic concept, the party, a controlling party, is either a joint controlling party or an individual controlling party. Non-disjointly with that, you have percentage and type controlling party. Just keep the label for that now, because it is a percentage and type, and the single property in there that you can't see of the percentage describes what percentage of the type of limited de facto control you have, and that's framed in terms of relationship to some activity which isn't shown yet, isn't modeled yet, but will be. Good. Does that all look like it gives us a basis from which to build further refinements, and at the same time looks reasonably accurate in terms of the kinds of things we talked about on this right-hand side. These are conclusions or assertions which may themselves then be input to further analysis way off the page, usually more mathematical than we can even ontologize. Okay, I have a comment in the questions queue. Richie Barber, do you have voice?
He is muted at his end. Richie?
Hello.
Yes, hi.
Hi, yes.
How's it going?
Good, thanks. Would you like to, do you want me to read out your comment? Do you want to expand on it? It's a very long.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to place in context some of the ideas you were discussing, and I was trying to think of an example. If I was using this data structure as to how I would apply it, it's usually the easiest way I find to give some context. And from my markets experience, I was just trying to think, well, would your limited de facto control apply to something such as a trading desk in a specific security, where that security is regulated by, a particular body, but those regulations extend to just that security? Is that a form of limited de facto control over that financial institution, limited to the scope of that particular instrument? Or I'm slightly out of context. I've missed a few weeks. I'm just trying to catch up a little.
Right. Okay. Understood. This is quite a semantically difficult change that we've made probably since you were last on here. The examples is always a good way of making sure that we've all understood and that we're not talking at cross purposes. So, a trading desk. Let's think through the scenario. A trading desk within a financial institution and have a mandate to trade a specific instrument. So trading a particular instrument is controlled by a specific regulatory body or exchange, and so the decisions of that regulatory body is asserting control over what the trading desk can or can't do. Yes, that is a good example of limited de facto control. Is it necessarily an example of the kind of limited control we're talking about here, of control of one entity by another? Or is it something more general that we can then specialize into what we're talking about here, I wonder?
Yeah, that's more of an operational detail in a sense. All kinds of rules and regulations that affect things that entities and employees and staff of entities can and cannot do. So it's not, that doesn't sound like it's a at the level of one entity exercising control over another.
Well, yes and no. I think there's two concepts here as well. You're right. There's operational control of what staff could do, but there's also regulatory control. Things like Regulation S and 144A and so on, which determine who can or can't buy or sell what shares to whom. Where the regulation is in place, it's not the staff being controlled by their line management or by the executives of the entity, but by some outside entity, the outside entity being some regulator. So I think there's a kind of de facto control that makes sense.
Well, I agree. Yeah.
Are we talking about the regulator then being a controller because it is limiting what that fund manager can or can't do? Now at a desk level, you're right, that would be line management. At the entity level, that would be where because the regulator can't say this desk can do that, but that desk can't, can they? The regulator can only say this entity can do that and can't do that.
Well, yeah, my only point was that there's all kinds of codes and regulations, building codes, work safety codes. I mean, if you get into the regulatory aspect of things, then in a sense you're almost you're looking at the whole environment. It's like Chris was referring to earlier. These are sort of the forces of nature that you're dealing with. If we got into the details of the kinds of regulations and controls and codes that are imposed on entities, it would be a very long list.
Well, that was principally why I was trying to think of an example. So I was saying, okay, so we're looking at an example where we're trying to model a case where one company or entity can exert control over another. And I was just trying to find some way of exploring that within the finance institution.
Yeah, and actually the notion of an entity that has people that can trade stock or buy stock, exercising control by buying stock and acquiring control is, that's kind of relevant.
But is that not de jure control because they physically hold the stock and they physically hold the ownership in the company, whereas de facto is some kind of implied control?
Yes, yes, I agree.
Right.
What I'm
Yes.
what I'm getting at is the optionality or the ability. It's kind of the they don't have the control unless they buy the stock, but the ability to purchase stock and make decisions is kind of the dynamic aspect of things. So
right, which, as you said, flows down. So a trading desk gets a mandate from management, and management, as part of an entity, is given the right to purchase that by licenses or regulatory approval for that operation.
right.
And is that a fair example of what we're trying to capture? What I'm trying to get at is, if I download this model into a semantic modeler, and I'm applying some concepts at this point for my institution or from institutions that my institution is looking at, what do I put in here? What's useful in this aspect of the model?
The kind of examples I was thinking of was if, for example, some entity, and I don't have any good real-world examples, so I'm really just theorizing here, but we're talking about a kind of control as being constrained by what kind of activity one can do. Suppose that some entity A has the ability to change the board of entity B, but not the ability to change its capital structure, or it has the ability to change its capital structure, but not the ability to sack people, or it has the ability to set bonuses, or it doesn't have the ability to set bonuses. And there's a topic example which brings us right back to that question you were just raising about where does the hand of the regulator fit into this picture. You know, we're trying to talk about corporate hierarchies, relationships between entities. Once you make the regulator one of those entities, there's an infinitely larger number of kinds of control which are exactly the same as the ones we're talking about, but which we were hoping to avoid. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, some of your examples there, like the ability to change the board, I mean, that would have to be written down for someone to be able to do it, right? In my experience, so de jure control. So then that's fine. I get that, and that's either through some controlling interest or some physical shareholding. You can suggest to management that they should change the board, and if management, just through your suggestion, decide to change, is that because you come up with a good de facto suggestion, or is it because you have de facto control over management and thus the ability to change the board, although not written down anywhere in documentation? And the only person I can think of who has that kind of control is a regulator, which then leads you back down the road of, well, if a regulator is included in your de facto control, then where do you stop? Because it's regulating everything down to the level of the security.
Right, yeah. So most of the kinds of control that we can think of examples of on this right-hand side would, of course, result from de jure controlling interest on the left-hand side, such as side contracts and so on. The reason for the split is we may not always know everything. We may think something has 51% or 60% of the shares and therefore controls something. We may not know there's a side contract. And if you then run the numbers again, knowing about that side contract, which is another de jure controlling interest, then the conclusions you draw would be different, because you now draw the conclusion that entity A has the ability to change the board or set caps on the bonuses of entity B. You didn't draw that conclusion before because you didn't know about that de jure instrument. But realistically, most of the things on the right, ultimately all the things on the right, should result from running the numbers of things on the left, de jure instruments, whether they be side contracts or whatever, or indeed laws. So, as you say, most of the kinds of control we're talking about will amount to de jure, so that's fine. But we may not know what somebody may assert, or they may have concluded, hey, I've worked out that entity A has the ability to sack the board of entity B. I'm not telling you how I arrived at that conclusion. I'm just telling you it. It's a meaningful assertion, therefore belongs on the right-hand side. You can always then try and reverse engineer that and figure out where it came from. So I think this does belong on the right-hand side as conclusions, even though, or even because it results from contracts and things on the left-hand side. So there are realistic examples other than regulators, but then...
yeah, that goes back to Chris's point that...
Yeah, go on.
That goes back to Chris's point that you might have statements about a certain amount of control, but not not know the actual terms or de jure nature of it.
Precisely.
So then, apologies again if this is just my naivety or lack of time on the call, but so in the real world, when this model is finalized and available to practitioners, you know, faced with this ability to define control, you know, you can imagine being used, for example, in a risk department, saying, okay, we're going to look at lending to company B, and we want to try and figure out if company A has control over company B before deciding whether to make a lending decision. Or maybe you're modeling yourself and saying, well, let's look at ourselves and see who has control over us as a business. You know, at the size of scale of institution we're talking about, if we're concerned about undocumented or invisible sort of de jure control side letters, I mean, how can you make a meaningful decision at any point? You need to you know, base your decision on some fact. I'm not questioning any of the aspects you have in here, but I'm just trying to say, you know, as a former trader, you know, armed with this model to define a case of the world or a state of the world, how do I apply this and make real decisions based on it? Because I guess that's what we're trying to get to with the whole ontology as a meaningful thing.
Absolutely, and I think here we need to come back to some fairly fundamental sort of philosophical stuff here, because I think, I just realised this writing is probably a bit small because I'm on a very large screen. Basically, meaning is not truth. When we run applications, and when we look at reports, and when we, you know, look at what's asserted in filings and so on, what we're looking at is either truths or assertions of the truth, which may or may not prove to be true when we learn something else later in the day, such as the existence of some side agreement or something. But that doesn't change the meaning of the assertion. And all that we want to do is capture what are the assertions or conclusions that may be made, whether they're true or not, whether when you run the numbers on the left-hand side with a different piece of knowledge of the world, you draw different conclusions about percentages and types and jointness or individualness of control and so on. Those conclusions, the numbers on the right-hand side, might be different each time you learn something new and run the numbers again. Or each time somebody who has some option of some kind of control now has exercised it and simply has that kind of control. So, to cut a long story short, we're not concerned with matters of truth here, but we are concerned with the meanings of the assertions which may or may not be true, or may not prove later to have been untrue. And there's actually a very interesting side aspect to that, which is a matter of legal discovery, where, and it's with not just the ontology, but with good metadata management as well, you might know what were the factors of input you were looking at when you drew a conclusion upon which you made a decision which later turned out to be incredibly foolhardy. You may be able to prove it wasn't foolhardy, it was just made in ignorance. You know, the company you bought didn't have the weapons of mass financial destruction that you thought it had, that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm catching up. Sorry, that makes sense. Good.
Great. Fantastic.
So does that get us back to a meaningful assumption that we can make, not being true or false, but on that dividing line between including regulation and all the things that come with regulatory controls, and with de jure control as it's explicitly laid out?
Well, it does raise an interesting point, which is, you know, I was rather cavalierly saying we only want to look at control relationships between entities because when you introduce regulators, there's an infinite number of them. But you are going to want to do that, and people will want to do that, and we want to make sure the abstractions that we have are such that you could, if you wanted, get into a whole room on the side there and create a whole set of maybe quite limited control relationships that are exerted by regulators and that matter to you in your particular firm, and that you need to extend this model to do that. So we need to make sure these abstractions do not prevent you doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Mike, I think it does in the sense that you have this sort of area to plug in details of codes and regulations that might be particular to your specific situation, but it's impossible to enumerate in a general model.
Yes, so we must be able to have people extend this, including where regulators are the holders of kinds and percentages of control. Right, good. So, at the moment, we've got a kind of control, we've got limited control, we've got percentage of it. There's nothing here that says the entity holding it is not a regulator. So you could simply then subdivide the party here, have two subclasses, each of which has a different identity relationship, because remember, a party is always something in a role. One of those could be a regulator, and one of those could be an incorporated company, or a legal person, or whatever the scope of things you're interested in, or even the whole scope of what we already have here, minus a regulator or something. I have to do funny stuff with logical unions to do that. So you could then talk about extending this in one direction for regulators, another direction for corporate hierarchies, and that wouldn't break the model as it currently stands, I think. Does anybody disagree on that? Does it look as though the abstractions are abstract enough for future extensions into where people might want to model the influence of regulators, or have we locked in any specifics here? You know, I think we're okay at this point. But it's a good reminder that what we have in this model at the moment isn't excluding regulators, and therefore isn't explicitly talking about control between one business entity and another explicitly. Now that does exist elsewhere on the left-hand side, which is where it belongs, I guess, where we talked about the hierarchies of controlling interests. So we went all the way down to incorporated companies, and even beyond that to where you have a voting shareholder, which is one kind of de jure controlling interest party. You also have a voting shareholding company where the range of entities that can be that are limited to companies. So we have that kind of limiting things down to companies right down here in the shareholding side of things. A thing to think about is whether any of that needed to be extracted further up. So we have the jure controlling interest party. I think it's okay. I think the only places we've limited the holder of something to a company is where we might want to then talk about company-to-company share hierarchies, such as total owning company, over 50% controlling interest company, and so on. We haven't done any of that on the right-hand side then. Should we? So this comes back to things like parent. Is parent always a company, or is it any entity? As defined in ECFR, and as defined here, it can be any entity. Therefore, a regulator or a sovereign could indeed be the parent of some entity and still be called parent, or in fact be called majority controlling party, but the labels are synonyms, essentially. Is that okay? Do we want to have anything that explicitly talks about these relationships only between companies, or not between regulators, or keep it at the level of generality, which incidentally does match the level of generality of the ECFR definitions, where they're always using words like person, which are very, very general. It sounds to me that if we keep it at this level of generality, then you can extend it to your heart's content, and indeed we can comment and extend this in the commenting period to propose extensions to the standardized material, as well as obviously people being able to extend this locally for particular use cases like modeling the influence of some regulator, or modeling what just happened when somebody got taken over by the state, or something like that. Um, so I'm talking myself into the idea that we're pretty much good on this. Anybody, and we solved what was bothering me in the model I presented at the beginning of this session, which was the one thing I wanted to actively change before we put this forward into the formal process. Good. So I think it's really up to you what we look at next. My instinct is that there's a lot to show here and a lot to take in without looking at the diagrams. And I was thinking that we should have a look at what's in the model, make sure that in the same way we've talked about here, we've got the right kind of very technical kind of term or usage, but the right kind of skeleton terms from which new stuff can be taken. It's definitely proved the value of the split that we made, which a lot of people have struggled with elsewhere, and we struggled with for a long time as well. So this is going to be a very powerful feature of the model. So this is part of the ownership and control hierarchies. I guess one thing I haven't thought about, and this is more of a modeling question, is whether to put the left-hand side and right-hand side terms into separate physical ontologies. They're all mixed in together in control party at the moment. So that for some applications you would be looking entirely at shareholder networks and feeding that into analysis. And in other applications you'd be looking entirely at risk factors to feed into risk analysis based on assertions of control. So there may be some value in putting this into these left and right hand side into two separate packages, and that may also make it easier to know which are otherwise very similar terms is which. Is that something that people feel I should do before formalizing the model? This is more of a modeler question, I realise, but it's a kind of a scoping question. You know, nearly all applications will only want to use some part of the whole of what's in the standard, because that's an inevitable nature of the standard. It's always going to have more terms than any one application will ever need.
Mike, how would that affect the situation where you're collecting data about this from various sources, and you have specific data about left-hand side shares, and you have other data about right-hand side assertions, but they all make part of the same view? It seems that splitting them into I'm not sure what the effect of splitting them would be, but it might seem that you are, you know, splitting the ability to draw some type of complete, inference about the situation. If you
that's a very good point, because if your use case is to reason over both kinds of data, or indeed to if we go to a more conventional use case, if you're taking data feeds from different sources, and one source just tells you percentage of shares held, and another source tells you assertions of control in corporate filings, and you want to be able to distinguish one lot of data from another so that you put them into different fields in a database even, then you will want both. I guess I'm thinking about, this is more from a modeling an OMG standard point of view. It's good practice to modularize things, but the challenge then is you do have use cases like you just described where you want both sides, and then you end up having to figure out which side should import from which side. I guess the right-hand side would always import terms from the left-hand side, because if you, it doesn't have to from an ontology point of view. I guess this is more of a modeler question, but yeah, maybe we should put it together for now.
So I would just back up what Jeff said. I mean, already we've got this, cast iron situation where we have got shareholdings as number of shares and types of shares. We've got shareholdings as terms of percentages. We've got subsidiaries in terms of direct and both indirect subsidiaries, and we've also got ones where there's just a vague control level type thing as well. So to me, and I don't think this is particularly unique to us. In fact, I think this is the likely to be the default situation, which is anyone that is modeling relationships is going to have to combine a lot of these relationships together. Now, must admit, I'm not sure what the implications of splitting them into ontologies goes, but I would say that from a practical perspective, anything that we can do to lower the barriers, if you like, to using it, it's going to be something that we'd be really grateful for.
Right, excellent. Okay, so we'll keep it all in one place as it is then. That's good. My instinct had been to split it, but you've talked me round, and I was worried that it's easy to get confused between the two types of relationships without the long explanation of how we got to this point. But at the same time, if people were looking at the individual packages, they'd be more likely to overload the meanings of the concepts in one of those packages with the actual semantics of both, and having them all in one place would avoid that kind of confusion. So for that reason as well, I think we're right to keep it all in the one package as it is. Good. And then the corporate subtypes of that, which is the one which is on the left-hand side, really, the share ownership is packaged separately just so that we have corporate control relationships. That may even be packaging too far, I wonder. So we have all of it in one, shares and partnerships and abstract levels of control all in one. Was it even useful to have the corporate ones in their own hierarchy, I wonder. I don't know. It sort of helps because they're all subclass, but you're right, when we look at the left-right distinctions, then it's not useful to separate those. So we'll keep the packaging as it is. Good, because changes to packaging are what caused me to get hundreds of new technical comments on the technical process. Good. Okay. So do people want to have a look at what's in the rest of this release and what's out and what changes we may have made recently, and just have a general sort of feel-good look at what's in there? The other thing is in each section I've got a separate UML package here containing just diagrams, and this is intended to be the kind of the neat diagrams that we put in our written report. Now, having said that, one unfortunate thing happened a few weeks ago. My trusty old laptop with my very old version of Enterprise Architect died. I've been resisting moving to the latest version in case it did anything strange. And in some of these diagrams, it does something strange, which is it redraws anything that's an L class. So this funny little round symbol, which just looks like a pump or something and doesn't exactly say non-technical diagram. So I'm probably going to have to just simply remove the class of thing from any of our business-facing diagrams, otherwise they're not exactly much good. The other thing it does is it puts this geeky set of angle brackets into any relationship that goes round in a loop, and I can't make it go away. So again, we have a couple of shortfalls in trying to create truly business-facing diagrams. But anyway, notwithstanding that, the intention is that the diagrams in each section, in the business entity diagram section, so we've got, I'll rename, by the way, formal organisation. There are a lot of things in foundations about organisations which are actually stuff we've worked on, like types of organisations, organisation parts, and so on. I've moved all of those into FIBO BE, so it's no longer just formal organisation here. We have types of organisation, illicit and legitimate, formal and informal, and so on. The logical union of things which gives our control party and so on, are all in this organisation section, which is now called business organisation. The only thing in FIBO foundations of an organisation is the very fundamental nature of an organisation being something that has members and that pursues some goal. Everything else is here. So that's a change in the scoping, and I need to come up with more of the nice diagrams than that. So each section, as I say, legal person is where legal personhood is defined in terms of the capacity for liability, and where body corporates have some instance of incorporation and so on. So the taxonomy of those. So these diagrams, the ones in the diagrams section of each, I haven't
question,
the
Mike.
word package, because yes, go on.
I just noticed the illicit versus legal distinction between organizations. I mean, I understand the intent there, but it could be that it may not be quite such a simple binary distinction, because you could in fact have parts of an organization that are colluding, or members that are colluding, and other parts that are legitimate.
Ah, interesting point. Now, parts of an organization are themselves organizations, so that may not contradict this model, but let's unpack this a bit. So when we originally put this in, so originally we just had formal organization, and then we said, although it may not look like it's in scope, we ought to include informal organization, because then we can look at illicit cartels and things, and then under informal organization we split them into illicit and legitimate. Later on, and I may not have had a chance to present this back, but later on we realized that formal versus informal and legitimate versus illicit are two separate facets. That previously it was really illicit informal organization and legitimate informal organization. We realized that you can be formal and be one or other as well. Now, having made that change, then yes, there's the question about what about if part of some organization is or isn't. So let's have a look at the organization parts model and see if that contradicts that in any way, because yes, a lot of this organization stuff I only just brought back into the BE section from Foundations, so have we looked at it in enough detail? Here's the parts.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of a test question would be, at what point did Enron become illicit?
Ah, right. I see where you're going with that. So an organizational subunit here, an organization has a part, which is itself an organization. We defined a couple of kinds of subunits like branches and divisions and so on. So these are kinds of organization as well as being kinds of organizational subunit, because an organizational subunit is a kind of organization. Now, does that help us with our question on?
Yeah, I think it does. You could classify different sections as being legitimate or not.
Ah.
I don't know. I just noticed it. I don't want to make waves.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing we're after. Because I do want to make sure that any new things we think of should, as far as possible, be additive. Because anything that involves a disruptive change would then mean we're going to have to run a fairly rigorous change management and issue management process, whereby, as with any hardware manufacturing thing, for example, some changes require you to send out a note to everybody who holds it saying you must now cut link A and solder it to link B, otherwise people will die. And other changes are, just a little addition to firmware, and you can just, do the change or not, and it doesn't affect the functionality of what you already have. So we want to be sure that what we have at the moment is as undisruptive as possible. So the N1 example actually neatly validates the change we made to have legitimate and illicit not be subclasses of informal, but be any kind of organization. It's worth, I think, putting the organization part into this same diagram so that the question you were talking about becomes more clearly answerable. Let's make that a little untidy, but
And the types of illicit organizations that are not public per se certainly are not necessarily informal. They're very organized.
Right. So a formal organization is something with an organization covering agreement.
Yeah, I see.
Yes. Fictional stereotypes aside, that may well be the case. Although more typically the kind of illicit organizations. So an illicit cartel is the interesting and perhaps less fictional one, because we're talking about cartels of formal organizations who are illicitly collaborating to do something. Then you have crime syndicates and things where the traditional approach to governance is precisely not to use any kind of de jure mechanisms at all, and certainly not to have any appeal to de jure remedies. So those would definitely never be formal organizations, but we're not modeling that they necessarily are or are not.
Right.
These would have members that are, but they themselves, you'd never have a discoverable contract setting out your illicit cartel activities. But the organisation itself, yeah, I see why this would normally not be. But I think, yeah, you can have in different jurisdictions, you can have something that's illicit, but it's still constituted as a formal organisation.
Yeah, and when does a cartel become illicit?
Right. Again, this is down to a bit like with the regulatory things. When do you take the very basic model and break it down to lots and lots of subclasses based on different activities you should or should not be doing, in the same way as we had control based on different activities you could or could not make somebody or prevent somebody from doing.
Yeah, I've got
Very
to
analogous question.
I'm struggling slightly with this. I'm sort of staying out just because I feel I wasn't involved in any of the discussions that took place, so I don't really feel I have a good view. But I would, there's plenty of legal organisations that would not be considered illicit. HSBC, for example, that perform illicit acts, and there were one that said that to me an illicit organisation is almost like one that is set up for the purposes of illicit act, or has become one that is there for the purposes of illicit acts. And so, it kind of feels a little bit difficult to. That's almost that goes to the purpose, which I don't think we're covering here, and it also goes to the issue of the purpose of the people holding, that control it, and the acts that may do, some of which may be, so for example, if you're running a company that's set up for money laundering, you'll typically do lots of legal acts as well as the illicit acts, and so that's a perfectly legal organisation. It might be a hairdresser's, for example, and you take money in and you do cut people's hair, but fundamentally it's a money laundering organisation and it's set up for that. So I can understand the issue of illegal cartels, which organisations, informal organisations, which almost by informal organisations. If it's a cartel, I think it's possibly is in most jurisdictions illegal, as opposed to a different type of grouping. But I think the when you get to illicit organisations, then that kind of feels like a different type of scope. But I have to say, because I wasn't involved, I'm not sure whether I've misunderstood the issues.
I think what you've done is given us some clarity on what was almost a throwaway thing at the time, which is, once we'd defined formal organisation, it made sense to define informal. Once we defined informal, it made sense to distinguish between tennis clubs and political parties and so on from illicit organisations. And then later on we realised that these were not necessarily mutually exclusive with formal organisations, although most of them would be. So I think what we've got here is a very good bit of clarity about an illicit organisation is not something which turns out to be doing something illicit, because that could change on a day-by-day basis or on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. But something which has been set up specifically to perform illicit acts or has become such. And I'm going to use that in the definition of this thing, because the kind of organisation which is not legal doesn't really say anything. I'm going to change that for the kind of organisation which is one which has been set up. Okay, that's a bit tautologous. Kind of organisation which has been set up specifically to perform illicit acts or has become such.
And once again,
the great clarity.
Yeah, and the definition of illicit is, of course, based upon law and not necessarily morality.
Absolutely, yes. That's a very clear. I mean, a church in Saudi Arabia is an illicit organisation by definition, and that's what it is, and that's unambiguous. It just so happens that it would not be an illicit organisation over the border somewhere. absolutely. And theologies aside, those are two very different magisteria, and we don't deal with the moral magisterium at all in this model. We're bankers after all. So, excellent. That was a good catch. Thank you. So yeah, that's
Mike. One quick question.
Yeah.
And this is Richard. This is more to the previous speaker's comment. Illicit. I mean, maybe I'm looking at a down-level definition of it, but doesn't illicit mean immoral or not ethical?
Oh, are we using the wrong label for what we're trying to say here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking legal, not.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I get that.
I always thought illicit meant illegal, but you're actually saying illicit means immoral.
I think to be safe, we ought to say legal.
Yeah.
Then we know that ethics and morality and things that may be important to all of us are really not part of this discussion.
Indeed, yes. And I hope we all agree that something that would be, because everything in this model is grounded, or as we've done with the securities models and derivatives and so on, it's grounded in laws, in commitments, in contracts, in legal instruments, because that's where the meaning grounds out. That's the fundamental axioms upon which all the details and nuances in this model are built. So nice that it would be to look at a grounding of morality. As a practicing humanist, I can assure you that there's a lot of work still to be done in that area.
Now, Mike, to be fair, words are horribly overloaded. So I just scanned the dictionary, and it does mean illegal also, but there are multiple definitions: illegal, immoral. So you're not incorrect. This is just a question of do we want it?
Yeah, because I was looking at it. Often there's a lot of clues in the etymology of words, and licit sounds good to me. Maybe I got it wrong, and my Latin is not exactly that strong. But licit sounds to me like legal. Because up until the Reformation, there wasn't really much of a difference between the two. So maybe etymology is not the way to go. So let's turn all our illicits into illegals.
I think you, in your comment, Mike, I noticed you made a tautology.
Did I?
That small comment you posted about illicit is illegal, or you said, if you go back to that, you said illicit may mean immoral or illicit.
Oops.
So you meant illegal.
I did. Thank you very much. That would have caused great confusion later. Good. Illegal organisation. I've got too many L's and I's, isn't it? Because you can't tell what's an I and what's an L in this font. Illegal organisation. There you go. 3 eagle organisation, and likewise 3 illicit cartel.
Yeah, it could be that illicit comes from licensed, not licensed.
Ah, yes. Yes, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Yes. And licensed by whom? By the state, or by the priesthood, or by the temporal Juno, or whatever, however far back the etymology goes.
You're not paying the fee to be able to operate.
Yes. I'm going to put illicit in as synonyms, because it is, as we've established, a synonym, but it's not the best primary label to use, because it can be interpreted in 2 ways, one of which would be wrong. Would that be acceptable? Illicit cartel as a synonym for legal cartel and illicit organisation. One possible meaning of the word, there's a heteronym there, where the other meaning for illicit is outside the scope of this model, and so you'd never find it by looking for illicit heteronym if you had such a thing.
And Mike, somewhere else in the model you have cartel as a part of an organizational collection that's not illegal?
Whereabouts is that? Because I thought we were using. Oh wait, you're thinking about the because years ago we decided not to include groups, and then yesterday I added groups precisely for the, so I'm just flicking through finding the diagram we started from, because we wanted to talk about this joint controlling party as, I'll find the diagram we were looking at, this one.
Yeah, these combinations, those could be cartels also.
Right, so the controlling alliance is a group, an entities group, and a group is specifically, this different color represents, it's a kind of collection, whereas an organization, very similar to a collection, but it has or works towards some common goals or objectives. So there's a little bit of discussion offline about the difference in goals and objectives, but ignoring that for the time being. So a group, so when does an alliance become an organization because it has an objective? That's a good point. Should it be an organization because it has some objectives?
Well, I think you implied that there are cartels that are not illegal, just by saying that you've identified illegal cartels as being a subset.
Oh, yes. That's right, I remember that.
And it's all a matter of regulatory perception as well, like WTO and so forth.
So we could have some multiple regulators.
Well, some folks will object to cartels no matter what, of course.
Yep.
And
that comes back to moral versus legal considerations again. So yes, I'm starting to wonder then, do we have a kind of multiple subclass situation around where is the character? The legal cartels could be a subtype not only of legal organizations but of cartels, and cartels could be a legitimate kind of organization, which is a group of entities that are working towards some common goal, which is what an organization is, and specifically a group of entities which hold some controlling interest in something. Is that a good definition? You're right. I remember us saying somewhere that cartels may or may not be illegal, as they are now.
So, and my understanding, and just from this is partly from vague understanding and partly from reading Wikipedia and a couple of other things, which should be people should be extremely wary of taking as authoritative. But my but the Wikipedia article does accord with my understanding, which is that the cartels, private cartels, that is those that are so public cartels are ones where the government has approved it. So most cartels, unless are I mean, I'm sure it's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but generally you have to get approval for a cartel, because otherwise you are open to price fixing suits essentially. And so a public cartel is one where the government has given has said we're not, that you're not liable to be sued for doing this, and a private cartel is one where you are. So I guess that there's illegal cartels and there's state-sanctioned cartels, essentially, I would think.
Right. Yeah, and when the state is a member of a cartel like OPEC, that makes it implicitly sanctioned.
Yeah.
Of course, yes. That was where that's right. That was where we came in with that note about them being possibly legal, and I can't find the diagram of the note in, but the members of cartels may of course be countries.
Yeah, so it's just sanctioned price fixing for the most part.
Yes, so a state sanctioned cartel is what do you say? Price fixing. That is.
Well, we probably should say market control. We probably should say something a little bit nicer, but it's you're trying
also more abstract.
Yeah, well, you're affecting supply and demand, which affects things. So
it's approved by some or indeed several states that might themselves be members of it, and other states and different. Now
is oligopoly in the
that?
meeting, in the model?
I wonder. It's not. Isn't that so? An oligarchy would be where some family groups. So an oligopoly where some family between them holds some level of control. That's now we're well into the realm of the sort of things that we'd like to have added to the model and make sure that what we're adding them to doesn't break, and we haven't got any assumptions that prevent that being in the model. So that's not in the model as a classic test. Can it be added without breaking anything?
Are you around for this a bit longer?
I am. Okay.
Just on a conference call.
So what is an oligopoly? We've got 3 minutes to go. Am I right, just from guessing from the word, that it's controlled by some family? Is that what it is?
No, well, it's a group of companies that together exercise significant control of the market.
Oh, right.
Right, but not necessarily full control.
Right.
But I mean, there's a continuum here.
Yes, it's in the context of antitrust or monopoly. If you have a small number of companies that have exercise, essentially it's a combination of an alliance that's because of their position in the market. It's not an alliance, but it's a if you have a small number of very large organizations, then you are ripe for an oligarchical. It's like in Russia, you have the private companies that are owned by individuals that own such substantial shares of things that they end up having political control.
Exactly, and that's why I thought oligo always meant the family. I'm sure it probably originally did, but it's kind of evolved from there, maybe.
Right.
So it's kind of like just on the edge of monopoly. So here's the thing to think of then. The current basic model, we need to be sure that we've got the abstractions abstract enough that you can build out into the whole area of antitrust and so on, where you're adding a kind of control which is not control of an entity but control of the market. So control of the market is not in scope of what we model now,
right.
But if we added it, would we be able to talk about the kinds of entities that exercise that control without having to break any of the existing hierarchies, so that, as with any good semantic model, all changes are additive? And that's the and I think, to be fair, you're not going to be able to answer that question just simply me whizzing around on the screen. So I hope that I've managed to get a model of which that is true. Between this formal version, as we bring it to the March OMG meeting in 2 weeks' time, and the June meeting where we have a 4-week deadline to submit in May, between March and May, we need to make sure that we have identified any places where the model might not be capable of additive changes, where we might have made assumptions that lock in things that are too specific. I think we've nailed them all, but of course we won't know until we've really had a chance to pore over these.
Yeah.
So that's where we are. Yeah, John.
Mike, I do think that in terms of an oligarchy, it's not a formal model or agreement amongst entities. It's an effect on the market, and effects on markets are kind of completely a different domain than organizations' effects on each other.
Exactly, and it's an interesting new use case, which I hope people can not have to build a whole new ontology, but extend what we have here, and whether you can or not.
No, I think you can.
Case, I'm almost tempted to use that as a use case for whether we've got the semantics of this right, is whether you can use it to extend into an area which it explicitly doesn't cover, which is market control. Maybe sometime in the future we'll do a FIBO for market controls and influences and risk factors, because that is a significant part of systemic risk, but it's not in FIBO BE. But it's a good test for whether we've got our abstractions right, as to whether you can do that without having to reinvent half the stuff we've already got in here.
Yeah, no, I think you can. I think, and it's not necessarily market control, it's just market behavior. So you're dealing with now, I think this model of organizations can now be applied to all of the activities that these organizations do, which ends up, summing up to the economy and the markets.
Yeah, and there's also things like exposure to geographical exposures in counterparty supply chains and things like that. So it's very large areas of systemic risk that will need this kind of future model of marketplaces and supply chains and geographies and industry sectors and all of that.
I know we're out of time, Mike, but having been an employee of an oligopoly, it's very much a matter of control. I mean, the thing is, you take action just to make sure you're clear of antitrust laws, right? And so to the previous speaker, you're right. They're all independently acting, and their combined effect is this market effect that you mentioned. But they're all conscious of it, and it's very much about price control.
Right.
In one man's opinion. I mean, it's just an opinion. I'm sorry.
No, I agree. And the price control aspect is the effect on the markets.
Yes.
And that's the whole other domain we get into when we start applying this organizational model to their behaviors in economies and markets.
Yes.
Yeah, this is where you take the stuff on our right-hand output side and make that the input side to way more sophisticated models, which one day we might understand the semantics of. So you can then at least compare the outputs of those different models and from different suppliers and reason over them.
And one other type of organization, Mike, would be just the associations, industry associations. There are lots of organizations that organize different companies and different activities in associations, and they have some effect.
Indeed. So we've got industry association in the model for the simple reason that some of our annotation metadata, where we talk about the origins of terms, we had to make ourselves the origins of some of those terms and conventions and things because they weren't already standardized, and we're an industry association. So it exists in a small corner of the model for metadata, and perhaps needs to be brought into this department as well somehow. So that's a very good point. Good, we're well out of time now. Now, next week, we've only got 1 week between now and the rest of the meeting, I think. Do we want to reconvene next week? And if so, what do we want to do? Because I'm now ready to freeze this model. I've finally got to the bottom of the last few technical issues, and this is now going to get frozen for the next couple of weeks at least. And then we need to look at branching it, putting it in different environments, and so on, and reconvening to look at what we do next. So do we want to meet next week? And if so, what do we want to look at? Or should we take a couple of weeks off and then reconvene after the rest of the meeting with a mandate to look at the next lot of business stuff?
Well, if you don't want to change anything, you might not want to meet.
That's my thinking. On the other hand, you might want to look at any changes I've made. No, any changes I've made today I've made on screen, apart from that relation to activity, which I'll deal with. So no, take a week off, a fortnight off. Is everybody good with that?
Sounds good to me.
Fantastic. And thank you all very much for getting us to this point. It's been very, very productive. So, thanks for staying on for the extra 5 minutes. Any last minute thoughts before we close the call? Wonderful. Thank you all very much indeed. It's been very, very productive. Do feel free to mail in any other thoughts and things